Hello, everybody, and welcome to a super exciting episode of JavaScript Jabber. Today on our panel, we have AJ O'Neill.
Yo, coming at you live, healthy and well, from the perfect temperature in the shed.
It's been a while. And me, I'm your host today, Dan Shapir from Tel Aviv in Israel. And today our guests are Matteo Collina. Hi, Matteo.
Hello, everyone.
James Snell. Hi, James.
Hello.
And Michael Dawson. Hi, Michael.
Hi, how you doing?
And today we brought you all over to talk about this excellent article, post, that you've written. I loved it very much, to the extent that as soon as I saw it, I contacted Matteo and told him, you have to come on our show to talk about this. All you guys out there should also read it, regardless of what we talk about it here. And it's called The 9 Node Pillars, 9 Principles for Doing Node.js Right in Enterprise Environments. As I said, this is an awesome article. Who wants to start talking about it?
So just go read it. I mean, there's, it's a...
Okay, let me start. This article starts from an idea from experience. Okay, start from the experience of developers do Node.js all the time. They think they know Node.js and they don't know Node.js. Okay,
that's a pretty unfortunate statement.
It's
true. It's absolutely true. Matteo and I, when we both of our previous employment, we were working, doing a lot of consulting work, going out with customers, and seeing the same problems over and over and over again. And in every single case, it always came down to folks not really understanding how Node worked internally. How does the event loop work? Those kind of things. And
it just occurred to me that I skipped a very important point while starting this conversation, and that's like who you guys are and why it is that you guys actually do know so much about how Node works and how it should be used. So maybe you guys should do a brief introduction of yourselves.
Yeah, we can do that. I'll go ahead and go first, and then let the guys go next here. So, James Snell, I've been, I'm currently with Cloudflare, work on the workers runtime, but a lot longer than that, I've been involved with Node. I've coming up almost on 10 years involved with Node, and at the end of this year, it'll be exactly 10 years. Prior to my current employer, Matteo and I were doing all kinds of consulting work around Node, use of Node, how to do things correctly, helping people with performance problems that they're having, that kind of thing. But also just I've been contributing a lot to Node. So a lot of the things like the URL, the original URL parser, not the original one, the WhatWG, and HV2 and a bunch of other things that I've been involved with adding. So that's me. That's my background.
Parsing URLs, that must be so easy.
Yeah, no. you can. I recommend for a future episode, get Yagi's on here. He did the Ada URL implementation that Node now uses, and he can tell you why it's not easy at all. So. Yeah,
I know. I was just being facetious.
Yeah, I'm Michael Dawson. I'm the Node.js lead for Red Hat and IBM, and I got, I actually got involved in the project around the same time that James has. And so I've been working for a very long time in the project. I'm a member of the technical steering committee, work in a whole bunch of the different working groups. Particular like Node add-on API is one of the ones that I'm pretty active in the build working group. And I think back to your earlier question is I think that the challenge is that you can very easily get started with Node.js, but actually getting it right is a little bit more difficult. And that's why we see things like some specific guidance can really help people going forward. Over to Matteo.
So hi folks. I am a little bit under the weather today, so I'm sorry. I didn't want to defer the recording. So sorry if I'm less excited as usual.
Feel well.
It's look. I have a lot at this point. I've been doing Node.js for a long time. I have accumulated a few hundreds npm deploy, a few hundreds modules on npm, which more or less total a very nice 1%, close to 1% of the total number of downloads of npm itself. Okay?
Wow.
It's a little bit unbelievable, to be honest. The numbers are, it has way too many zeros in them. Okay.
You've been busy.
Well, yeah, everybody seems to love the code that they push out for free. So anyway, few years back, I started this company called Platformatic to push Node to the next level, and that's what we are trying to do. And we have been trying to fund some of those initiatives and things and promote Node.js. So here we are.
Cool. Now, you guys all work at different companies, so you're obviously all three of you very much involved in Node, but your day job is at different places. How did it happen that all of the three of you came together to write this article?
Oh, I can take this. So basically, it's actually one person that is missing in this call, which is Natalia, that was also part of the review. Okay, and Natalia is also the lead owner and for JavaScript DX and DevTools for Azure. And the four of us, this started from my idea, from an idea that I had a few months back, and says, look, how can we promote and solidify that knowledge? Okay, and how can we start pushing back against all the bad tutorials, all the bad practices that are out there, and plugging every single Node.js code base that I have seen. Okay, because that's frankly what it is. So at that time, I started looking and said I pinged a few friends and decided, look, who can I ask? I want representation for a bunch of different companies and so on. So, and let's try to put our minds together and write something up that can be that we can be happy with and can help developers. You're doing Node.js well, and stop those spaghetti code mess that they do most of the time. So.
Yeah, and one important point for me is none of the information in this blog post is new. It's stuff that we've talked about in talks over the years for conferences and workshops, and each of us in various ways have talked about these things before. Unfortunately, a lot of that gets kind of washed out in the noise of there's so many of these tutorials that just kind of get things wrong, and it ends up washing out the good information just kind of in that noise. And so it's as many times as we can repeat this stuff, get it out there, I'd like to see us repeat this again a year from now, just kind of keep reiterating on it, keep going.
I'd love to have you as guests on again and again in the future, individually or together. Just say the word. Obviously, we will enumerate through the pillars and talk about the positive stuff and the things that should be done and can be done and need to be done. But to make it spicy, I do actually want to start with some of the negatives, if you don't mind. You guys said that you encounter so many bad practices and so much bad advice and bad code. And without naming names, can you give some examples?
Oh yeah, we can do whole examples. A couple years ago, I did a talk.
Oh, go ahead, James.
A couple years ago, I did a talk called "Broken Promises." There's you can find it on YouTube, and I paired it with some workshops. Just that kind of breaks down some of the really bad ways people just get things wrong, particularly around promises, because they just don't understand how they work. I had one former consulting customer where I walked in, was doing a workshop. Their lead engineer on the team started arguing with me because he believed that creating new promise was just like creating new thread in Java. So no, it's completely different model. and this was their lead engineer on the team, because he just did not understand how this stuff works, and we just kept encountering that over and over and over again, that kind of stuff.
I just posted the link, by the way. We'll also put it in the show notes to that talk.
So
yeah, that's pretty amazing. Like, I can understand why somebody might confuse a worker with a thread, but confusing a promise with a thread, that's pretty extreme.
But look, we can even go to way more basic stuff. Okay, like let's talk a little bit about updating Node.js. Do not use deprecated code. It's unbelievable. Okay. The companies are not updating Node.js. Like, this seems, it's bizarre.
Once you deploy something, though, it's working, just let it be, right? I mean, I know a lot of companies are, in some sort of hype cycle where they're just deploying the latest framework every other day. But I think a lot of profitable companies are creating a product, and once that product is good, they're not going to rock the boat on it every 5 minutes. They're going to let it cook.
Also, that old joke about the developer and his son walking down the road, and the boy says, "Dad, why does the sun rise in the east?" And the father says, "It works. Don't touch it."
Those are good points. But, no one wants to use software that is full of security vulnerabilities.
Well, maybe they should stop putting them in Node.
Maybe they should stop putting their product on the internet then. That's a pretty instant way to... You pull the plug. It's secure by default. Okay?
I mean, so an application... An application that has proper isolation around it, like say, if all of the routes coming into that thing are secured and it's not exposed to the internet, it's just like a long-running enterprise application that's there to support existing business processes. If they don't update, they don't update. That doesn't matter because they have that isolation, and the types of threats that are coming at that server are much more limited. But if something's out on the internet, if it's exposed to the internet, you don't want to have software running that has these security vulnerabilities. You really should update. And as updating it, you can't just like throw a new version out there. You need to see what other changes are going on. Like, we'll deprecate things that people really should not use because it could be a security vulnerability, but but removing it or changing the way it works is too much of a breaking change. And we don't want to force a breaking change on people. We just want to strongly nudge you away. Right?
Yeah. Also, it's not as if those organizations aren't updating their own code. I mean, if the project is dead, then it's dead. But, we are primarily talking about, living software.
No, not
updated.
Dead, profitable. There's a difference between dead and profitable.
In order to be profitable,
it's not a suck of engineering resources every week. It's actually making money.
Yeah, but in order to be profitable these days, you need to be a service. And the only way to justify being a service is continuously releasing updates, even if nobody asks for them.
Well, I was going to say one thing, circling back. I don't think I have seen anything break in Node since version either 10 or 12. So I recently updated an application. I was so afraid because I'm actually using private APIs in the networking layer. I updated an application, I think it was version maybe 12 or 14 all the way up to version 20. And there were no issues. So Node has become incredibly stable probably after version... I want to say after version 10. I think there was a ton of breaking changes in the version 6 or 8, but version 10 or 12, it's been incredibly stable, and the likelihood that you'll have to go debug things is unless you're using an experimental feature, you had experimental flags. But even then, I don't think I've seen any breaks in the experimental features in the last several years.
There are a few. There are a few. They're usually pretty small, but they happen every now and then.
None of the ones that I used, like Fetch and there was something in Web Crypto. Maybe there's some more niche things that are weird, like was that it's like a lifetimes thing. I forget what the name of it was. I don't know if it's still a thing, but there was like some sort of a lifetimey thing.
And probably
You know what I'm talking about? Yeah.
Everything
Okay.
about
Yeah.
async
So
hooks, yeah.
that might be like, there's some of that stuff that was super experimental. I didn't touch, but anything that already had a web standard was the stuff that that I've been using that's been experimental.
It's certainly like, if you follow the discussions in the project, we really are careful about that, and we think carefully. And if even the ones that James mentioned, we do make some small breaking changes, but we think very carefully about those. We try and understand the impact, and so I think that's one of the things the project has been doing quite well over the last number of years, is to try and minimize that. The other thing I wanted to add to what James was saying is, like, it really comes back to risk management. You can continue to run on older versions. And I think if you've done your risk management, you've done your analysis, like, you may, again, back to your point of, like, it doesn't cost any money to leave it just running. So that is good. And if you've actually thought about it, maybe you're doing the right thing. I think we just don't necessarily see that people are, like, thinking about it enough in terms of, like, should I have updated? That's the easy answer, is if you stay on the list, you're going to get the security fixes. Or there's some companies like the one I work for that will give you longer term support, so you're probably okay then. But, like, we'd probably like to see a few more people either very carefully looking at their risks or sticking to the LTS releases and the ones that are active, because those are the ones that, like, the project is going to help.
Yeah, but now you're starting to go towards the actual pillars, because that's literally one of the pillars.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just push us towards that, and let's maybe start going down the pillars, unless you guys want to mention something else before we do that. Okay,
No, let's go ahead and go.
Let's start with the pillars then. So pillar number 1, do not block the event loop. That's an interesting one, because it's actually also very much pertinent to the browser, not only to Node. And actually, it's also pertinent to Dino and Bun. By the way, I will say that quite a number of these pillars are relevant, or almost all of them are also relevant to Dino and to Bun, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them are relevant, to whatever server platform almost you're using. They might be relevant if you're using Java or Go or whatever. But again, we'll be focusing on Node in this conversation. So again, the first one is do not block the event loop. We've discussed the event loop in the past on this podcast, but maybe it's worthwhile for one of you guys to quickly explain or reiterate what the event loop is and why it's so important not to block it.
We can talk about it just in very high level general terms. Node has its event loop, which is based on libuv. It is structured a particular way. Dino and Bun and workers, and so they all have event loops that work slightly differently. They have different phases, different slightly different implementations. So they all work slightly differently, but they all have the same fundamental concept of it's going to be monitoring the system for certain events, I/O. Hey, I want to read a file, or I've got a network connection, or whatever. And as it's turning, it's going to say, oh, I got some I/O. I'm going to fire a callback. And that callback is going to go off and run some JavaScript. And what's important to understand is that while that JavaScript is running, the event loop is not. It pauses while you go off and run that JavaScript. And then when that is done running, it comes back and the loop continues. It doesn't matter what platform you're on. That's how it works. Unless you're using worker threads, which you have multiple event loops running on different threads, whenever you're running JavaScript, nothing else is running. All right, you're not going out and pulling I/O. You're not, looking for, you can't go off and accept a new connection. Any of that kind of stuff, right? So you have to make sure that JavaScript that you're running can return fast enough for that event loop to turn around and do something else.
Now, on the browser side, it's maybe less catastrophic, but it's often more obvious when there's a problem with the event loop, because user interaction starts to get janky. Somebody clicks, a button and the UI doesn't respond because the browser is too busy processing the JavaScript for a previous event. What's the negative impact in Node when you don't process stuff out of the event loop quickly enough, or when things stay in the queue for too long?
I have a very nice talk on this, okay, which I recommend everybody to watch. I'm going to paste it. I'm going to summarize and then paste it into the chat for everybody to take a look. Okay, so the gist is very simple. What is that? What happens? Okay, you take the event loop gets busy. Okay, the problem, it doesn't, you say, well, the event loop is busy, what problem it can be? Okay, well, generically, if there is only one user, okay, which is, for example, the case for deployment on workers or in AWS Lambda, this is essentially, the impact is very limited, okay? However, you are also missing out on the key feature of Node.js and JavaScript itself, because you can, supporting multiple users at the same time allow you to maximize the use of the resource of that single process. So what happens is that once the amount of load goes over, and there's a little bit of math involved, goes over a certain threshold, the response time of your application will start getting, will start looping into, will start growing in an exponential fashion, and therefore at that point your application will stall completely, very quickly, and not responding, not nothing, spinning wheels. Typically, the problem is if I send a request, okay, to you, if you've done a good job, you are going to respond, your server is going to respond in, 200 milliseconds, a second, 2 seconds, okay? After, what's the threshold after which I stop responding? Okay, I stop waiting for a response, okay? But the problem is that when you receive an HTTP request in Node, Node.js has received that request and will continue processing that request up independently of the fact that the user on the other end is still there, okay? You can detect that, you can handle this with about signals and a bunch of other stuff, but it's definitely not common, okay? So, and the generic result is that when Node.js reach a certain level of load, it becomes very much unresponsive. Your application become unresponsive completely, and this is a massive problem.
I have a great example, based on a former customer. I'm not going to name any names and stuff, but we were called out to do some consulting work for them because their Node application was very, very slow. They were getting a whopping 4 requests per second production. Like, what the hell are you doing to only get 4 requests per second? Well, what they were doing,
they're calculating pi to the trillionth digit on every request.
Well, almost worse. So they were using an old version of Apollo that was not very performance optimized. Every GraphQL query that they would receive was very complex, and it ended up being where they would do like 10 to 15 sub requests on the back end. That back then, the way that Apollo worked is it would receive the request, it would parse it, generate the AST, walk the AST, go off and submit all of the sub requests, wait for those to return, and then would have to go through and do this process of reconstructing the response. Unfortunately, these queries were so complex that it was blocking the event loop. All of that processing was synchronous, right? Now, waiting on the sub requests, that was asynchronous, but the actual parsing and walking of the AST was fully synchronous, and they were blocking the event loop from progressing every time that happened. And they were blocking it by so much that, it couldn't get around to take the next request, right? The other problem that they were encountering, though, is roughly maybe about 15% of their requests were failing with timeouts. I'm like, we don't understand why these are failing with timeouts. Well, what would happen is they would send, like I said, 10 to 15 backend requests, right? Sub requests. Those would go to the backend systems. Those systems were responding quickly, right? And having responses pending in the IO queue in the Node event loop. But if you look at the phases of the Node event loop, what you'll see is almost right before we poll for pending IO, we check timers, right? In that loop, we always check timers first. What was happening is that the event loop was being blocked for so long that by the time the event loop turned and came to invoke the timers, even though that those responses, the sub request responses, were waiting to be read, the timeouts on the sub requests would fire and cancel the entire thing.
Oh no.
So it was just like this compounding problem that all of this synchronous activity blocking the loop from actually advancing IO, tripping itself up.
If I'm thinking about it, I can basically perceive of two main problematic scenarios here, and correct me if I'm wrong. One scenario is that even though events are being handled relatively in a timely fashion individually, the rate in which they're coming in is so high that the server is simply unable to complete the processing the events at the rate that new events are coming in. That's problem number one. And problem number two is that regardless of the rate that events are coming in, sometimes the processing is so lengthy that the loop is just being blocked for so long that it's making the system, and the system is unresponsive during that time, that causes problems because other events time out or not processed in a sufficiently timely fashion, all sorts of problems. So the service might be even mostly not busy at all, but whenever something comes in, it just gets stuck for too long a period. Am I understanding correctly?
Yes. And if that event happens too often, it gets into a catastrophic failure. And most Go ahead, Michael.
I was going to say, the event loop's really optimized to do lots of short things. And, you talked about the first case of things coming in too quickly. Well, Node can scale to take a lot of incoming requests as long as you quickly hand them off to something else to if you come in, you take a request, you hand it off to the database, and you do that asynchronously, it can scale to lots and lots of things coming in. And I think as Matteo was kind of saying, but if you get to a point where you're trying to do too much in the event loop itself, because you're effectively sharing a single thread, you're now going to slow everything down, and it falls over a cliff at one point. So, if you've got longer running tasks, you really want to push them to worker threads. And a good example that I think is
or to other servers,
or to other servers, but
like a microservices architecture or something.
Exactly. The one thing I think is kind of interesting is even if you have your microservice, you say, okay, I'm going to make a microservice for my very long running job. You still don't want to block the event loop for that microservice, because the main event loop, because, well, what if you deploy that microservice to Kubernetes? Kubernetes is probably going to have a liveness check. And, well, how is that liveness check going to run? It's going to have to hit that main event loop and say, hey, are you still alive? And we literally
had this problem.
Okay,
At the company that I worked at, again, without naming names, we were actually using Prometheus and the Prometheus client. And without going into reasons, the Prometheus response that was being generated was huge. And it was a huge string being serialized. And that just took too long. And if that happened while the liveness check happened to come in, it could literally cause the liveness check to time out and cause Kubernetes to kill that instance.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you always want to push your long-running jobs onto worker threads so that your main event loop can respond quickly.
And this problem is not unique to Node, not by any stretch. Now, in other runtimes, it manifests differently. Like workers, we have a completely different threading model in workers than Node. Every request is basically running on its own thread. Coming in, we can still accept other requests and that kind of thing. But an isolate, a particular worker, might be used by multiple threads. So whenever one request is being processed on one thread, right, no other threads can use that isolate, that can use that, that particular instance. And we have to share these. So we have these things that are called, basically lock contention. It's waiting for that lock, waiting for that isolate to be free so I can use it on this particular thread. And it jumps around. It's a different mechanism, but it has the same effect of blocking other things. If one particular request has too much synchronous processing that goes on for too long, then other threads can't acquire that lock and can't progress. They can't, run their own JavaScript. And it ends up being the same basic effect as blocking the Node event loop. So you just got to remember.
Don't think about locks so often. Sorry, just that I'm not used to thinking about locks so often in the context of JavaScript. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, I mean, but they're there, and the key concept here for this particular pillar is, yes, run JavaScript all you want, just do it in short span, short bursts. Don't do these huge, long synchronous processes.
So basically, either push processing off of the main node thread to workers, to microservices, whatever. Don't wait on them. Just send it and wait for the asynchronous response, or break your long-running JavaScript into multiple shorter segments. Like it might be anything, the set timeout 0 for the win.
Set immediate, typically the task that the command.
Yeah, I know.
But yes, unfortunately, yes. Okay. In that way, other things can be scheduled in between. Okay. So that's the gist. But generically, I would say that we do have enough technologies right now to run things easily on worker threads that you should just be using threads. Like literally, most developers don't think that Node.js is multi-threaded these days. It has been since 2018. And most developers think, they're still reading that tutorial from 2015. So that's the problem.
I have to say that there is one issue with it. And I know that there are several proposals that are looking to address it, but so far it still exists. And it's more of a JavaScript issue than a Node issue. And it's that serializing stuff across workers can be sometimes more expensive than the actual work that was offloaded. Like serializing and deserializing each way can sometimes be more expensive than the actual work that you offloaded if you're not careful.
Of course, but it means that you need to offload stuff that is bigger, essentially.
Yeah.
Yes.
And there are ways around that, with like shared array buffer and some of the shared data structures we have. So.
Yeah.
So Node has the ability to run multiple processes. So you can fork and you can, I don't remember exactly. I kind of forgot it because it turned out not to be useful for this very reason, that the communication between Node processes of doing the JSON stringify and the JSON parse makes it so that you should probably never, ever do that. And the only way that you should be using Node, if you're going to use multiple processes, is not its child process forking mechanism, but rather you just run multiple processes that handle multiple requests and let them, connect to the database separately and stuff.
Yeah.
Where would that be profitable? Where would it actually make sense to use that? Cluster. It's called Node Cluster, right? Yeah. Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's kind of an obscure feature most people don't know about.
Yeah, I think today
you're doing. Okay.
I was going to say today I would defer to other things like Kubernetes will manage multiple instances of your Node application, each which should be stateless. So like if you want to scale, there's lots of non-Node specific ways of scaling processes out, so you can have multiple copies of your microservice. So that's why I wouldn't necessarily be using the cluster module on its own anymore. So it's really like, I would typically scale using those technologies when it's a matter of just needing more than one thread's worth of throughput, because you could have lots of little tasks, but you just still can't handle all those tasks on a single thread, in which case let's scale out to multiple processes. But if you have long running tasks, even if you have enough to maybe only take 50% of your single CPU, you don't want to do those on your main thread loop. You want to still push those to workers, because you don't want to be blocking all the work based on those lower or longer transactions, right? Even if there's like 1 in 10, every 10th second, you don't want to have something that takes a really long time and slows everybody down.
Yeah, I think it was Jake Archibald that said it in the context, or maybe it was Surma that said it in the context of browsers, that one of the reasons that you want to offload things to workers is not so much, sorry, about performance, it's more about consistency. That you don't want all of it, like every X task to suddenly block your system for too long. I do have to say, though, that in my experience, most of the work that I've seen done on Node is mostly as quote-unquote middleware. So very often there's not so much heavy lifting being done inside the Node service itself. Let's say it this way.
Are you sure, Dan?
No, I'm not. Now I'm scared.
Like, so if you take a look at what all the front end meta frameworks are doing lately, all of them are massively blocking the event loop. Like they celebrate
because of all of the rendering code, all the server-side rendering stuff.
Yes. So in that scenario, if you already have a very expensive rendering pipeline, and you also need to do some data processing, data mangling that can take some CPU time, you really want to push it somewhere else. Okay.
And do they?
Well, not on the tutorials, but yeah, you can, but not on the main tutorial.
No, I'm asking if, from your experience, the framework makers are doing the best, the best that they could do to offload stuff.
No, they are.
We're starting to get better.
It's getting better and better and better, and I think it's not like a lot of it comes around on the marketing side versus the framework itself. Okay, nothing in the frameworks blocks you to do certain things. Okay, but it's more about how they market the frameworks and the products that cause, like, they make those applications. They teach developers using their frameworks very often that they could do certain things, and those certain things will work very well up until a point, and then they won't work anymore. But they don't tell you that point.
Yeah, and the Prometheus example I think I gave is a pretty good representation of that.
For that, okay, what we have recently been done we have recently launched a product called the VAT application server, and what we do is we use one worker thread. So we run the applications in the application in a worker thread, and we keep the Prometheus in the main thread. So in this way, we can have the monitor, okay, not affected by the application itself. And in this way, you can keep things. We can keep things responsive and up, okay, and be able to monitor them correctly, even if the application is under heavy load.
Yeah. By the way, just to toot my own horn, I actually contributed back into the Prom Client project an optimization that basically just reduced the runtime cost of serializing the string by something like 50%. So,
thank you.
That serialization thing, and going back to AJ's original point there about the cost of serializing the data back and forth across these boundaries. All right, it doesn't matter if you're using a worker thread or a child process or whatever, IPC, doesn't matter. The serialization and deserialization back and forth those boundaries always has a cost. You can use, faster serialization frameworks, so protobuf or CatNP versus, instead of serializing everything as JSON, but you're still going to have a cost. So it's like anytime you're distributing this load, you need to do, take effort, take steps to minimize the amount of serialization, deserialization you're going to do. If you're using a child process, rather than sending a large chunk of JSON, just pass the FD, right, and let that child process read the data off the network and do its own own parsing or whatever. If you're doing worker threads, use shared data objects like shared array buffer, rather than things that need to get copied and serialized using structured clone. The more of those kinds of things you do, the more effective this load distribution is going to be, because you're not going to eat up all your performance gain on serialization deserialization cost. So.
Well, we've been stuck on the first pillar for such a long time. It's pretty obvious we won't be able to run through all the pillars, which is just a great excuse to invite you all over again. But still, unless somebody else wants to say something about the first pillar, I think we'll move on to the second one. Is that okay with everybody?
I think we have covered the second one too,
Yeah, to an extent we have. It's monitor node-specific metrics and act on them. This is one of those recommendations which is true everywhere, for every system, not just for Node.
I will say that on this,
monitoring.
Yeah, I'll say on this particular pillar, there's one here that is worth calling out that most people, most Node users, even the long-term ones, aren't familiar with. Event loop utilization. Folks still talk about event loop delay, right? And that is a different metric. Event loop utilization is a relatively new concept. It's been there for a couple of years. Most people don't know about it. And it's a measure of how efficiently.
Maybe 4, James. Yeah. Maybe 4.
Yeah. The event loop utilization is a measurement of how effectively your event loop is processing tasks versus waiting for things. And it's a much more accurate metric of how well your application is performing than event loop delay. So everyone really
before you continue, because I would like you to explain it. I'm familiar with the term, with a metric called event loop lag. Is that just an alternate name for event loop delay?
Yeah, that I would think so, yeah.
So event loop lag, which I knew, was basically what you described. It's looking at the mean time or the 90th percentile between when an event gets into the queue and until it gets processed, pulled from the queue in order to be processed. And obviously there the statement was, you want the mean value or the 90th percentile or whatever to be basically as low as possible in order for the system to be responsive. But you're talking about something else. You're talking about event loop utilization. Can you explain that metric to us?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things that go into it, but it's basically a ratio of how much time your event loop is spending doing things versus just sitting idle waiting for things. So let's say if you have an event loop that is just going off, your application is just going off and scheduling a whole bunch of I/O, and then it has to wait a long time for that I/O to do anything. And in between those times, it's not actually processing anything else, right? In that case, your event loop is not being utilized effectively. It's spending most of its time being idle, waiting for stuff. But if that event loop is able to turn over very, very quickly, accept a new request, while it's processing other things, while it's waiting for that other stuff to happen, if it's able to keep processing things, then you're going to see a higher utilization. That basically means your event loop is doing more efficiently. I hope that's clear. There's a whole paper on it.
Okay, but I'd be happy to have a link to that paper. But one thing does concern me. It does seem that if I pull in like the first event and that triggers an infinite computation, which means all the other things are just stuck in the queue forever, my event loop utilization would still appear to be great because I'm just processing forever. Like, is that, am I missing something?
Missing some of the details. It takes some of those things into consideration. The paper goes into a lot more detail, and this was done by Trevor Norris at NodeSource. The blog post that he wrote on this initially, introducing it, answers pretty much all the questions about it. Right? It is one of the best research papers.
Consider you can take event loop utilization in a slightly different way. Okay. Consider this: an event loop delay or event loop lag. Okay, it's a metric, okay, that you can measure, okay, after there is a lag, okay.
Mhm.
However, you only have a lag, okay, if your event loop is very busy,
Correct.
okay. Event loop utilization is able to tell you that your event loop is getting busy, so you can act on it way sooner than the event loop lag. Okay, in fact, is a much better
Basically,
proxy.
what you're saying, if I'm taking too long to process user requests, but I have very few users, then I might not notice that I have a problem. And by the time I do realize I have a problem, it's kind of too late in a sense, because users are already suffering.
Yeah.
What
Yep.
you're saying is with event loop utilization, I'll be noticing it much earlier and be able to respond to it, in advance.
Yes.
That's really interesting. I very much would like to look at the paper.
It's
The other thing that it does,
go ahead, James.
I'll just mention real quick. The other thing that it does is it tells you how well you're scaling, and it gives you a much more accurate scaling point. So a lot of applications previously would look at CPU usage, right? And when node process was primarily just one thread, one main application thread before we had worker threads, that was an okay measurement, but it was still pretty noisy. As soon as we introduce worker threads, the CPU monitoring just goes out the window because it becomes way too noisy because because it's not fine-grained enough to be able to show you individual event loop processes. The event loop utilization is per event loop, so it's per worker thread, and it gives you a much better signal at where and when you need to start scaling your application to multiple processes and multiple worker threads. Better than any other metric that I've seen. This is the one that gives you the best accuracy for that.
And monitoring systems these days, do they expose this metric?
Well, Platformatic does. So, if you... sorry for the pun here, but our product, our commercial product, absolutely. But also all our open source expose this metric as part of the Prometheus integration. So you can essentially take it and consume it and so on and so forth. The important part is that you want to set your autoscale to look at this metric versus CPU. Okay. If you look at CPU usage, you are typically it's too laggy. Okay. Once the horizontal pod autoscaler see that stuff, you are already in trouble. Okay.
But it's not a metric that's built into Node or whatever. There's no like.
No, it is.
Event
It is. There's an API for it. Yeah. There's an API built into it and directly in the node. It's part of the Perflux API.
You need to enable it in Prom client.
Very cool. Very cool. We'll definitely look at it. Thank you for that. Anything else about pillar number 2? Okay, then moving on to pillar number 3. News Node LTS versions in production. I think it even though people listening to us should be familiar with Node, I think it's worthwhile to mention what Node LTS versions actually mean.
Yep, long-term support. This
Michael,
is basically.
Michael, you want to take it?
Sure. Yeah, you can go to the website on the GitHub. It's like Node.js/release. It'll have our schedule. Every it's a very predictable release schedule. We have a current, which happens every April and October. And then every even current gets promoted to long-term support. And long-term support means, I think it's 30 months of support. So it lasts from, October this year, for example, to April 2.5 years from now. And the odd currents, they only have 6 months of support. So, why we say you really want to stick to the long-term support versions is that, that's the longest period of time that you can sort of be on a version that's not going to go out of service. And back to AJ's point of we don't want to change things any time. We don't want to change them because it costs us money, right? So you want to basically look at the release schedule and pick the LTS that's going to give you the longest runway. I'd also say schedule. You don't have to move up to every LTS because we have multiple overlapping LTSs. We either have 2 or 3 usually going on at the same time. So if it was me, I would basically say like, okay, when am I want to go into production? Let's plan to have the closest LTS. And then, 2 years later, I should plan on like, okay, now let's plan for upgrading that particular version to the next LTS. There are multiple phases in LTS as well. There's like an active phase where we backport changes quite quickly. So if you want to get new features, they still go into those LTS releases. But about after the first, and I'm thinking it's 8 months-ish now, I'd have to look exactly at the numbers. It then flips into maintenance where things are more like as needed, security fixes, that kind of stuff.
Why do non-LTS versions even exist, and why would I ever use one of them?
There are people who want to be on the bleeding edge, and so those ones give you, based on our schedule, we feed things into those non-LTS versions first. So if you want to get the very latest, greatest, you can try them out there. And we do appreciate that people test them out for us and give us feedback. And, so if you want to take advantage of a new feature, we really do want people to try those out and give us that early feedback.
And there have been cases where I've had to use a non-LTS because there was a critical feature, particularly related to web crypto or fetch or one of those standards that is cross-platform standard for JavaScript that was only available at first in the non-LTS. And right now, for example, Node's ESM support has finally completed, but it won't be available until V24 without the flag. So I'll probably update to V20.
Are you sure?
Maybe 23. Yeah.
Are you sure, AJ?
Now
I have a very good news for you. I have really very good news. We are likely thinking of backporting it to 22.
Yeah.
Oh, sweet! That's great. Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, because that's something I've not been using ESM because, why would I publish something to NPM that breaks everybody else's stuff and everybody else has to transpile? But then all those people are using bundlers anyway. ESM just didn't make any sense. And then when I saw that, I was like, yes! Finally, I get to not have to screw around with all this, window crap.
This raises the good point. It's like, why do we have this, the schedule? If you think back to when, before Node and Node.js, Node was originally going way too slow. Node.js came in and was going way too fast. So this LTS schedule was let's find a middle ground. Like, we're going to have one LTS per year, but why do two majors? And the reason for that is because the ecosystem needs to be able to have these features out at a faster rate than only one release per year. And so, the short-term, odd numbered currents, those are primarily to help the developer ecosystem in Node, not the enterprise, production users. It's there to help the module developers in the ecosystem that are producing all of these dependencies keep up on the rate of change, and allows Node to be, to know what's actually being used. How does this need to be evolved? Actually get used to these things before it goes LTS, before it goes to where we have to maintain something long term.
And it's still considered to be a stable version, an official stable version. So I'm not working on some beta or whatever. I am working on an official version. I just get the let's call it modern or bleeding edge features sooner, and I don't have to wait a full year for that stuff, and I can have it ready in advance of that LTS release.
It still respects Semver, so you can expect that there shouldn't be really any breaking changes, but features go in more quickly, and it really does help us in terms of the versions we promote to LTS. It's great to have that 6 months as a current, because that really helps us find out are there any things that we missed in terms of was it more breaking than we expected? And, means sort of that 6 months means that by the time we go to LTS, we have a much better chance of it just being boring for everybody, which is what we like.
I really want to be respectful of all your time. We are nearing the time usually where we start pushing towards picks. I'd love to continue this conversation for now. It's also earlier for me because we've switched to daylight savings, and you guys, well, off of daylight savings, and you guys are still, at least in the States, are still there. So I don't know how long you guys can go. Do we have another 30-something minutes, or do we need to start thinking
I do.
about wrapping up?
I got time.
Yeah, I'm okay.
I'm okay.
Okay, let's keep on going, at least for a while. Let's see how far we can push it. Anything else about this pillar before we go to the next one, which is a whopper? Okay, then. So pillar number 4, it's automate testing, code review, and conformance as much as possible. Again, this is like an absolute truism of software development that has, it's true for Node, but it's practically true everywhere else in the world. By the way, there's this click, so I don't know where it's coming from, but guys, please be aware that there's like this clicking sound going on. Anyway, so what do we have to say about automating tests and code reviews and conformance that's Node specific? Or is it just, do it?
I think what my perspective on this would be is that, one of the advantages and why people we hear use Node.js is that they can move really quickly and they can innovate quickly. For me, that's great if you can move quickly, but it makes your testing and your regression test all the more important. So while this is very important in most cases, it's even more important when you're moving fast. And because Node lets you move fast, that's why it's so relevant to me.
I totally agree. Part of my job at almost everywhere that I've worked in the past over a decade is going into existing projects and starting to mess with them and literally break them. And like the difference between having tests and not having tests is like life and death. Literally, it's like, how confident do I feel even going into this project?
Yeah, it's like if you can make a change, run the test suite and feel pretty comfortable that the world's not gonna light on fire, that's what lets you move fast. Because if you don't, if you're like, oh, I made a change, but nothing's testing this, you're always very cautious, right? I think, and you're not gonna go as fast.
Now, you did differentiate between like the 3 different kinds of tests that people usually talk about, which is unit tests, integration tests, and end-to-end tests. Now, I'm curious, because I hear different people putting different emphasis on different types of tests. So I hardly ever encounter people who say, you don't need tests, but I do encounter people who say, it's all about the end-to-end tests. And other people are saying, no, it's all about the unit tests and so forth. So I am curious which camp you guys fall in, if you even do fall in a camp.
For me, I don't necessarily care about the type of test. I care about the test coverage. And I know a lot of people, have a problem with chasing complete test coverage and stuff. I don't
measuring test coverage.
Right. I don't care necessarily what kind of test it is. I care about, is this line of code tested? And too often, folks will only test the happy path. They'll write their test based on what they want the code to do, not based on what the code actually does. And they end up missing coverage on half the branches that their code takes or could take, and then they get it into production or make some kind of refactoring change and things just break.
One of my problems with end-to-end tests, which on the face of it, end-to-end tests like they have they could have been the best tests because they literally test the system as it should work. But from my perspective, there are 2 main issues with it. One is that they can run pretty long, which means that people run them less often. And the other problem is that testing coverage with end-to-end tests or achieving good coverage with end-to-end tests can be pretty challenging.
I think
because a lot of times.
I was going to say, I think I'd agree with kind of the challenges. Like I think the end-to-end tests, like along with that, is it's sometimes harder to figure out what went wrong, or like you made a tiny change and you only, if you only find that in your end-to-end test, it's probably going to be hard to figure out what that tiny change is versus.
At least you found it before production.
Yeah, no. So I think it's a balance between the two, right? Like I think having unit tests, which gives you really good coverage of the very specific things, will help you find, like, hey, I just made a commit and I broke something, like on the, but broke something small. I can find that very easily. And so you want as much unit testing as you can afford to cover, find those things. But then you still definitely need the end-to-end tests. But you probably don't need to test every single thing in the end-to-end test, because, like you said, that quickly becomes too long, and you can't run it as often, right? So it's finding that right balance between, having your unit tests that they won't be able to cover everything in the end-to-end style, but covering as much as you can, and then as much of the end-to-end testing as is practical, so that it still gets run on a regular basis.
Also, it's much closer to the actual code, so you're much less likely to miss branches, at least at the unit level.
Right.
And a lot of times the integration tests are incapable of testing particular branches, like particularly if they're edge cases, or should only happen in like critical failure situations where your end-to-end test isn't actually able to trigger those, right? Because it's meant to be some internal failure, or IO is failing in some case. Those unit tests are going to actually make likely.
Yeah, we all know the remedy to a critical problem, which is console error.
Mm-hmm. Of course, yeah.
Okay. Anything else we want to say about tests? Any recommendations about the systems you guys use for testing? Any particular system or mechanism I should be using as a Node developer?
Use Node tests. Use the new test framework built into the runtime.
What I can tell is what not to use. Okay? Don't use Jest. Make yourself a favor. No, this is true. Okay, if you're building a Node system, Jest has a lot of good features. If you're using it for some of the front end meta frameworks, okay. But if you're building a Node app, an API, or something like that, don't use it. I recommend, because you cannot test 100% of the branches with it, and therefore it completely defeats the purpose of a testing framework. So. If I can't.
Why is that, by the way?
Because in Monkey Batch is globals. So if the node emits an error in one of its own APIs, however, the error object the node create is different than the one that Jest has put in the global. So if you do error, instance of error, it returns false, even though it's an error. You don't know how much time.
Well, now we have in the JS spec, we have error is error.
I mean that should help, but yeah, with Jest, and it's not just Jest. I mean, a couple others, have had this issue before, where the test you write ends up testing the mock rather than testing, the actual runtime, the actual code. We had this problem in workers. For the longest time, we're doing local tests. Because our test framework originally, like that client-side part, the original version of Miniflare, was actually running in Node. So when you would go to develop your worker and test it, you were actually testing it against Node's implementation of something like readable stream. And then you actually go to run it in the runtime, and oops, it breaks because we have slight differences. And, we're getting away from that now, where you can actually test on the actual production code. But a lot of these test frameworks like Jest have that fundamental problem where you're not testing the thing you're actually running.
And I think Matteo's point might be like it has some advantages if you're closer to the front end side of things, but if you're really just a Node microservice, you might be better served by something that's more Node focused versus that.
And in that case, just use the built-in Node testing framework.
Yep.
Cool. Okay, moving on to the next one. And I think You know what? We'll see if this is the last one, or we'll manage to get to number 6. It's kind of stopping in the middle if we stop in this one, and then we'll give us an incentive to do another episode. I'd love to have you guys on again. This is such an awesome conversation. Okay, then number 5, and again, this is just a golden rule in software development, but I think it has special meaning in the context of Node, and that's avoid dependency creep. Can we explain what dependency creep means in general and what it means specifically in Node?
So this is probably one of the most misunderstood practice, especially lately. It's like the Node has been at the success it had only because it was able to solve one specific problem. In fact, Node didn't do it, NPM did. It found a way to do software reuse at massive scale. Okay, and what's the mechanism? Well, by allowing multiple.
And it turns out that you're a substantial portion of that reuse.
Pretty much.
Right.
I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. Okay, I am one I think
you're that guy from that that guy from the XKCD strip about that
it's for
developer
Italy.
in Arkansas.
Yeah, it's for
not Arkansas,
Italy.
but Italy. Yes.
So that's it. Okay, so it's avoid dependency creep. So Node.js had the massive success due to this software use. It allows you to, for example, use different versions of the same libraries in different dependency trees of your app. Okay, this means that you can have, and this happens very often, readable stream 1 in your code base, readable stream 2 in your code base, readable stream 3 in your code base, and readable stream 4. Okay, and when I will ship 5, you'll likely have 5. We'll have 5. Okay, that's what it is. Okay, so there are some modules that get that are in a lot of dependency chain because typically for a typical historic reason. And at that point in time, they were useful, but now probably way less so. So maybe you should stop using readable-stream and maybe start using, not just the Node stream module, because that's all of it. But however, there's a lot of things where you still want to use that module, and therefore here we are. Okay.
So you made actually 2 points here, I think. First of all, you're saying Node itself is advancing and it's offering many built-in features that in the past did not exist, that in the past we would have needed to bring in like third-party libraries. Now
Yes.
there are built-in features in the platform. And as with the browser, whenever I can leverage an existing part of the platform rather than bringing in a dependency, it's almost always a good idea. It's going to be a stable API, a well-tested service, an API. It's going to be there forever. I don't need to worry about maintainability, about security, about who gets ownership of it and starts pushing malware into it or whatever. And it's probably going to perform better and so many advantages. So that's an obvious thing. But the other point you're saying is that I should be wary of having multiple versions of the same package running within my single node instance. Now, I understand why it's a bad thing on the browser side, because I've actually seen a browser-based application deliver 3 different versions of Moment.js, which resulted in like a huge download, which is a problem on the client. Why is it a problem in my Node server, though?
The first problem is related to your surface attack. Okay, the more dependency you have, the more you are exposed to potential attack. You want to have generically dependency that you need, and only the dependency that you need in your tree. Okay, so this is the first point. okay, which, each one is a vector, is a potential attack vector. So you need to treat them like that, okay? And the other stuff is it increases significantly the install time of the application. So if you do, and increases, CI time, okay? Just a tiny bit, okay? But then a Node app can have easily 3,000-4,000 dependencies once all said and done. And then you start seeing, okay, can I just maybe remove 1,000 of those? Okay. Each one of them needs to be downloaded in independent.
Just 1,000.
I'm just like, a lot of them, like there's some of them that are trivial. Okay. And frankly, they should, not be modularized, but there we are. And some of them,
and a lot of them don't need to be down leveled, right? I mean, people just don't update their dependencies when they can. And so some of them end up just being brought in just because somebody decided not to update.
It's also the fact that it's like this sort of a skeleton, like the hip bone, like how that song go, the hip bone's connected to
Right.
the thigh bone and so forth. So you bring in one node package and that brings in 2 more, which bring in 8 more, which bring in 16 more. And all of a sudden you have like the entire universe downloaded into your node instance. And you did put that comic strip in your article about how the npm modules folder is heavier than a black hole. How do I contend with that?
I think the principle was about like be more intentional about that. If you can easily pull in a package and you're using some small part of that package, but you should take a look at like what all did that pull in. If that pulled in 100 other packages and you've effectively replaced 10 lines of code that you might have written yourself, maybe you should just put the 10 lines of code in, right? So, as Matteo said, the reuse is one of the fantastic things about the ecosystem. It's really easy to pull in code and reuse it. That's great. But I think we could use a little bit of a shift towards being a little bit more intentional and looking at what you're pulling in versus the benefit you get. So that you're sort of doing the right balance between, hey, I'm reusing code easily versus the sort of risk that I'm taking on. Because, if I've got a huge amount of code, it's not just the attack vector. What if there's a bug you want to have fixed? Are you able to do that yourself? If not, that's something you should probably at least think a little bit about.
Yeah, maybe you don't actually need left pad.
Right. Like, yeah.
Yeah, the sad thing is that given the average experience of developers, there's a good chance that half our listeners don't even get that joke about left pad because they came into the industry after it happened. Yeah.
Well, the question is, are they still using it today?
There's a good chance that they are, though, but they probably don't know it because they're probably not using it directly. They're probably using something that uses something which uses left pad.
I think we need an ethos change to be more like Go and Zig and other sane languages. Make the standard library great again and get rid of all the crap dependencies that, there's so many, even security dependencies where the people who are doing it obviously don't know what they're doing. You can't blame them because no one who did know what they were doing was doing it, right? But I remember one of the early, very, very popular OTP libraries was atrocious. In our industry, I think because of there being so much money available, and thank goodness there isn't now, I actually think, I hope that the interest rates stay high. I hope they don't go down for the sake of our industry. For the sake of, lots of other things, maybe, I don't know. But our industry was ruined by low interest rates because with free money, there was no responsibility to a customer. And then there was no craftsmanship. And then it became an ego thing. Like, look, I don't know what I'm doing and I'm getting so much done anyway. Look, I don't understand how this framework works. I don't understand how the library works, but look how great I am anyway. And we need some sort of an ethos change to like, hey, I'm able to do this with just a standard library. Isn't that pretty cool? Hey, I'm able to understand how my code works. Hey, I've got a handle on what my application is doing. Because if we don't have that ethos shift, then we're going to get stuck in the same rut that we're in. I mean, like, we're not going to leave the rut. We're already stuck in the rut. We're not going to get out of it.
So an interesting thing that I have to mention. So a few episodes back, we had Ryan Dahl as a guest to talk about Dino 2 when it came out. Now, interestingly, when Dino itself first came out, Dino 1, one of the things about it was that they avoided NPM and did try to provide like their own more significant built-in standard library. And the thing about Dino 2 is that they, well, surprise, surprise, they now support NPM, because it turns out that without supporting NPM, you can't really
get enough investment.
Well, not that. You can't really build practical things, especially for the enterprise.
Users want to reuse NPM modules. I mean, that's all it is. I mean, so that the whole joke about NPM being this black hole, that's exactly it. It's got such a massive gravity in the ecosystem that you cannot avoid it. Right.
Right. But I don't say I'm not going to use Go because I don't have NPM, or I'm not going to use Rust because I don't have NPM. Right. I mean, when you create something new, when you create something that's fundamentally different, you have the liberty to not take the baggage, from prior years. Like you don't use C in some rare cases you use C and Go, like SQLite or something like that. But, in other languages, they're not afraid to say, hey, one of the reasons we're creating a new language and a new platform is because we want to leave the crap behind. We don't want the crap to come with us. I'm sad that Dino conceded on that point.
I'm not convinced the other languages have totally have necessarily done better. They may be at a different point on their journey. Like I know in Go, I'm working on build packs for Node.js. They're written in Go. That's the place we actually have like a dependencies that's deleted, that's preventing things from being updated. And so NPM has gone through a fairly long learning process. And some of these other languages, like, it'll be interesting to see if they end up in the same place, or, they just haven't hit some of the challenges that you get with the scale that Node has gotten to yet.
I'm trying to remember who said it. It might have been CO. I don't remember, but basically they said that without NPM we wouldn't have had cargo. So even though NPM is not perfect, it's the most used, and that definitely says something.
Yes, though I am sad that they based cargo around NPM because it shows, and it's got a lot of the same problems, whereas the Go package manager is empirically as perfect as it can be, meaning that it has the fewest trade-offs, and you can prove that mathematically looking at the graphs, and there's a talk where that's been done. So that is really sad that we actually have something that we know both mathematically and practically works out, and we still choose other things.
Well, it was not there. Like the Go package manager
for NPM, I know. Yeah, for NPM, I know. But I'm saying cargo. But like it's sad that with cargo.
I don't think it was not there. Sorry, it was not there. I think cargo predates the Go package manager. I'm pretty
really
sure. Yeah.
Oh,
the Go package manager came out very, very, very late in the game. For a long time, Go was, in fact, the original Dino 1 package management came out from Go, and they just say, well, you point it to a URL, and then it download it, and it handles it. Okay, which was essentially how dependency were managing Go prior to that.
Okay, yeah, for the mono repos, yeah, that was definitely, yeah. Okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah, because it came out in 2018, and then it was confirmed final in 2019, which. It seems that's more recent than what it seems like. It seems like it was a longer time ago, but then I guess Rust wasn't really even hitting popularity until after 2018. So when I think about it, my memory's wrong. My memory's corrupt. I'm faulty. My bad.
Yeah, going back to some of the kind of the original thing with dependency creep and everything else. So NPM, like I said, it has this massive gravity, and if folks are using those modules, they want to keep using them. Unfortunately, there's just so many modules on there that they don't need to use. My canonical example, if you go out there, and I don't want to pick on it too much, but there's a module out there called isEven. all it does
But
is
that's parody. That's a joke.
it doesn't matter. I've seen people use it. It doesn't matter if it's a joke because I've actually seen people use this in their code.
Like
because
not a joke. They used it as not a joke.
Yes,
like,
because it was there.
That's scary.
It is scary. But the first time I found the is and even module, which all it does is pull in the is odd module and negate it.
And that like has a list of 1 million numbers, right, or something like that. It's not even something simple like doing mod.
No.
Because I know one of the parody modules just has a list of numbers like 1 to 1 million, and then for every other one returns true. Okay, so it's not that bad.
No, this actually does work. And we'll check to see validate that the input is a number, and and that kind of thing that is odd. But all is even does is pull that in and negate it. I've seen, there are a ton of modules on NPM that like you just don't need, and people pull them in anyway because they're not thinking about it. They're not being intentional about it. Going back to Michael's earlier point, or they don't understand what the module is actually doing, right? And that's what they need to be focusing on. Goes back to the same thing with the event loop. Be very intentional about what you're doing.
I have a problem with that statement because to a great extent, the whole idea of reuse is that I don't need to think about the implementation details. I can basically just look at the API surface and be content with that. If I can assume, let's call it a good actor. If I need to start looking under the hood of every NPM module that I'm using, why am I even using these modules?
Well, it comes back to the being intentional about it, right? And like to some extent, but you have to understand there's a trade-off. If you don't understand what the module is doing, it might be doing something incredibly performance costly, and suddenly your application is slowing down. You go into production. Why is it slowing down? Well, when Matteo and I countless consulting jobs where we went out and found, hey, it's your dependencies that are slowing you down because they're just not written to be very performant in any way. And folks, well, we didn't know that. If we had known that, we wouldn't have used it. Well, do some digging. Look at what your dependencies are doing. You have to be aware of the code you're putting on production.
A good metric, because I think that with Rails, and I don't think that this necessarily was what the Rails community intended, but it, bad pun, the idea went off the rails. Dry, right? Don't repeat yourself. It became a sacred cow that people didn't understand, and they just started to say it without knowing what they were saying or what it was supposed to mean. And this "don't repeat yourself" became this, this religious fervor. And I think a good metric would be, does the number of letters you have to type to search for it or query for it exceed the number of characters you would have to type in order to implement it? Because if so, you're on the wrong track. You should just copy and paste that code or type it out again.
It'll be interesting to see if AI code generators make a dent in this. If people can, instead of pulling and if they actually make an improvement also. If somebody, instead of pulling in a module that does something, can tell like ChatGPT or Copilot or whatever, write me code that does that thing and then copy pastes it into their code, is that better or worse?
I have had great success with ChatGPT writing far better code than what exists in the ecosystem that I could find. And I'm not just looking at modules that have the 1,500 plus stars. I'll look for things that have 10 or no stars. I'm just looking for the best code that's available, and I'll go peek at the source code. Two things that come to mind. One was SHA-256. Because Web Crypto has SHA-256, but it's really, really slow because of the context switches and the async. So if you need SHA-256 for anything more than a one-off, I would not recommend using web crypto. So all these modules on NPM that have SHA-256, they're all really legacy. They're, some of them are using a transpiled buffer implementation from Node. Like none of them are using UN8 array and modern JavaScript. They're all like decrepitly old. And I asked GPT to write me from scratch a SHA-256, and I was so skeptical. I spent 2 hours testing it, pulling from other libraries, like grabbing their tests and bringing that in, because I thought there's no way that it created a better library than anything that exists on NPM in a one shot. But it is a really well-known algorithm. There's lots of training data and lots of languages. And GPT does kind of tend towards simplicity. It doesn't have a context window to be able to create 7 different class hierarchies to do something. It kind of has to be able to do it in a function or two, which I think, also speaks to the greater average of the human consciousness. Humans are not really good at holding 7 different class hierarchies in their context windows, although they like to think that they do. But in some ways, I think that GPT is more truthfully reflecting reality than people are perceiving it. Another instance was a CBOR parser. And, CBOR is something, there's not very many implementations of it, but the implementations that exist outside of JavaScript are extremely high quality. And so it was able to write me a CBOR parser in a one shot, other than I had to make a follow-up prompt because there was one function that didn't fit in its context window. So I could tell that it didn't have, one of the functions was missing. And so I said, hey, you're missing this. And I took that and it worked. And so it at least in JavaScript, I can tell that, and part of it has to do with my memories, because in GPT, I've told it, hey, remember that I prefer this style, remember that I prefer this style. So I have also prompted it to be simpler in the way that it writes code. But it was able to one-shot 2 complex things that, certainly nobody could write in 30 seconds, and very few people could write and feel confident that they wrote it correctly. And, I was able to test it and see that it did work. So, but I think it takes the senior mindset to do that in the first place, because you have to be looking for, hey, I looked at the code of this SHA-256 implementation on NPM, and it's absolute garbage. Not necessarily because it was always garbage, but sometimes just because like it's got browserified transpilations, which, hey, back in 2010, that was what you had to do. That was.
I don't think it's the senior mindset. I'm looking at my kids, and they're getting into dev, and they make significant use of those AI tools. So I definitely think that there's a possibility that AI tools may reduce the amount of packages that we import, because they'll write those one-shot type codes for us that we often need, instead of importing.
And then what will happen is that bugs will spread everywhere.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's why I said it takes the senior mindset, because you have to know to test it. You have to know to determine if it's slop or if it's real. Because depending on the day, when they update to a new model or, do the revisions, I'll have a day where I'm coding with GPT 4.0 and, it's just like banger after banger. And I'm like, wow. And then a day or two later, I'll be asking it questions that might even be simpler or whatever. And it'll turn out just absolute crap. And it's like, okay, I got to write this myself.
I think that goes back to another aspect of the reuse, is that like if you're your own person, like if I'm just writing code for myself, I don't mind writing some new stuff and using that, because like I'm the one who's going to have to maintain it. If you're working in a company, I don't really, if I ran a large company, I wouldn't want 100 copies of the same thing written by 10 different people, even if they're using AI to do it more quickly, because there's going to be different bugs. There's going to be more investigation. So part of the sort of the reuse is being intentional about what you reuse. And when you do reuse things, like the great thing in the JavaScript ecosystem is we have tons of choice. The challenge is that we have tons of choice. So at least like within an organization, you should try and rein in that choice a little bit and say, well, okay, we're going to use one version of X. Like, let's not pick 10 different ones, because now we've just increased our surface area and our risks by 10 times. We're going to pick one, we're going to reuse it. And, that's one way of continuing to maximize the value you get through reuse. But, being intentional about the dependencies you have in your application, and as an organization, managing the risk so that you get a good balance between benefits or reuse versus the code you've got in your code base.
If we bring it back to the pillars, if you look at every single one of those pillars, a key ingredient in every single one of those is intentionality, right? It's get you to stop and think about your code in some aspect of it. What are you testing? What dependencies are you using, right? How are your tasks broken down, right? All of it is just about this notion of being very, very intentional about what you're doing with your application. Dependencies are no different. Don't just pick a dependency because it exists. Pick a dependency because it does what you need it to do the way you need it to do it, right? And and understand what it's doing. And it doesn't matter if you're having AI write your code; it's the same thing, right? You have to be very intentional about it, about what you're trying to accomplish.
Guys, I need to drop. Unfortunately, it's about time for me. So I just want to say thank you very much for joining. I unfortunately would stay longer, but at this point, I really need to drop. Okay.
Thank you very much for coming on. You are going to be a guest on our show to talk about something else in any event pretty soon. So we'll see you then. So thank you very much for coming on today. And I'm going to push the rest of us into picks anyway. We will just have to invite you over to talk more about the pillars, because we literally made it halfway. We made it into the middle of pillar number 5. So now we have the rest of pillar number 5 and then 6 through 9. And this is such a great conversation. I'm so happy that it's turning out this way. So thank you, Matteo, and see you in a bit, in a few weeks.
Bye.
See you, Matteo.
Bye.
And you guys, so again, I'm going to push us to picks. AJ, do you want to go first?
Sure, I've got a couple. So I'll go ahead and throw out my link to the SHA-256 implementation. If you have an application where you need to be doing multiple SHAs in a row, this is the best implementation that exists in JavaScript. At least there might be one that's just as good, but I was not able to find it, so I had to publish this. And it has been tested extensively, so I am very dollars are on the line with it. But anyway, so I'll do that just as a self promo since I talked about it, because if web crypto works, because you only need to do 1 or 2, that's great. But the legacy modules that are out there, I would not recommend them, because they're doing all this weird browserify stuff, or it's just they're old, they're dated, they need to be replaced, and so go put the first star on there if you want to. And then another thing I'm going to pick, we're heading into winter, so we're in this season right here where I am of nearly perfect temperature, which the weather's been really odd this year, and the cycle of it's been kind of strange, but the last week or two has been pretty perfect temperature. We're heading into the 30s this week, so it's below freezing even. So that as soon as it came, it's over. That's how Utah is. It's like your spring and your fall are very, very narrow bands. Like even 2 weeks ago, it was up in the 80s. This week, it's down in the 30s. So that's how it goes. But with it becoming winter, static shock is a thing, at least for us here in this dry climate. And a buddy of mine introduced me to these grounding mats, and they sell them as kind of woo-woo, hocus pocus, like it's going to alleviate your back pain problems while you sleep or cure your depression, which I don't believe that a grounding mat is going to do any of that. If you do believe that, I'd be curious to know why. But honestly, I actually would be curious to know why. Is there some sort of science behind it, or some sort of actual lived experiences or whatever. But I got them, and I've got one for my feet and one for my hands, just because I started to develop this fear of touching the keyboard, because every time I did, it was a heavy shock. It wasn't just like a little I touched your sweater. It would really build up. And so I got these grounding mats so that I don't shock things. Also, real story about electric shock. I took my home network down for 2 days. And I kept on unplugging things and replugging them, and then it would work for another hour and it would go down again. It turned out there was a network switch that was connected to my desk, and I believe that what had happened was that I had inadvertently touched that one of the cables that went to the network switch. It had gotten into a bad state where it was just spitting out some sort of packet. I honestly believe it was from static shock, because I had unplugged a bunch of other things, but I'd missed that one switch. And when I finally found that I haven't actually power cycled this thing like I thought I had. I think I had power cycled it, but it had a USB connection, so it would still have power from the USB or something like that. But anyway, I unplugged it, replugged it, and then I didn't have those network problems anymore. Very, very weird situation. But I think just getting shocked flipped a bit. So it also could potentially protect your electronics from malfunction, having one of these grounding pads. So I linked to one that actually feels nice. It doesn't feel cheap and junky. It has it feels like real leather. I don't know if it is, but it feels like real leather, and it's very, very effective in terms of if I'm using it, I'm not constantly shocking everything on my desk. If I'm not using it, or like walk away on the other side of the room and come back, then I put my hand down, and of course I shock myself. But anyway, grounding mats. Who knew that could be a pick, but it is. And that's what I got for y'all today.
Excellent. So now I'll go with my picks. I actually have 2 picks. So my first pick is, we watched on Netflix the limited series called Monsters, the Lyle and Eric Menendez story. This is a pretty famous and pretty gruesome story from the end of the 80s. I think the actual event happened in 1981, about these 2 brothers that basically executed their parents. And they were caught. They went to a trial. I won't spoil the rest of the story. There's actually 3 ways. The funny thing is that there are actually 3 ways to watch it on Netflix. There's the limited series, which is a dramatization of the story. There's a documentary series, and then there's a documentary movie. We watched the series and enjoyed it very much, and that's the thing that I would recommend the most. It's well played, well written. It's just good, pretty good television. Afterwards, we tried to watch a documentary series because we were kind of interested in the story, but it just went into way too many details for us. So instead we watched the documentary movie, which was interesting in the context of the series we just watched. But again, if you're gonna watch something and just the one thing, do just watch the limited series. Again, it's called Monsters, the Lyle and Eric Menendez story, and it's a pretty good story. The one thing interesting about it is that recently, I think the governor of California, I believe, said that he's reviewing their sentences and people are saying that it's potentially because of the stories that came out due to these all these shows and all the discussion about them, which is kind of interesting how art impacts life, I guess, in a sense. Anyway, so that's my first pick. My second pick is things have been, it's kind of, people have stopped talking about it, maybe because of the elections in the US, or maybe people just moved on, but there was a whole lot of craziness around WordPress. Like, it kind of seemed like the guy who's running Automatic, who is like the, what's it called? The benevolent dictator of WordPress, which is Matt Mullenweg, I think his name is pronounced, seemed he kind of went off the rails. I won't go into the entire story. It's pretty out there. A lot of crazy things happened. And if you are curious about what actually went down and what's potentially still going on, the one video that I would recommend to learn everything about it, at least everything as of about 2 weeks ago, is a video made by Theo also known as Theo3GG. It's actually in his Throwaways channel. We'll post a link. He actually spoke with Dan Saltman, another podcaster streamer, a bit less technical, and explained to him his the whole thing. And Theo was kind of involved in it because he actually spoke and interviewed Matt, and to the extent that his videos became part of the depositions in the ongoing lawsuit that's related to this whole story. So again, if you're interested in this craziness and wackiness in the open source world and where open source can go in bad situations, then it's a pretty interesting video to watch, and I recommend watching it. So these are my two picks for today, and I'll post the links to both of them. How about you, James? Do you have any picks for us?
Let's see. Well, first of all, I'm sorry if I get any audio. My earbuds just died, so I'm on laptop speakers now, so there might be some echo, so I apologize for that. Let's see. Picks for today. Next week, we got NodeConf EU happening in Ireland.
Oh, wow.
It's always my favorite time of year, getting back to Ireland. We're actually returning to Waterford Castle. It's the conference is an actual castle. You know, it's just an absolute wonderful, fantastic venue. There's still some tickets available. I know folks from the U.S. it's maybe a little harder to get over there. Last minute, but if you're over there in Europe and you have the time available, it's an absolutely fantastic conference. Going to be talking about cross runtime compatibility. So all this effort, like dnode to act like Node, Bun working to act like Node, Workers is trying to act like Node. How do we ensure that all these different runtimes work the same when it comes to standard web APIs, that kind of thing? So we're going to be talking through a lot of the challenges that all these different runtimes have to actually make sure that they're compatible with a language like JavaScript that allows you to basically do whatever you want. So that'll be a fun talk. But the other side of it, and this is just like personal side. My son is going. My son has been a contributor to Node for a couple of years. He's doing his own talk there with another person, Claudio. We're going to be talking about the work that they've been doing to improve Node release downloads based on Cloudflare R2 and some of the other work that they've been working on. So if you have time, go. We'd love to meet folks there, and that's.
The family that nodes together stays together.
Yeah.
Cool. And how about you, Michael?
I'll my first one, I'll just agree with James. NodeConf EU next week is going to be fantastic. The other thing I've been doing lately is spending time learning a little bit more about AI, trying to use the libraries from JavaScript. And the great thing is often JavaScript or TypeScript is the second language supported. So if you look at a Llama, LlamaDex, LangChain, which are all leading libraries in the AI space, they obviously all start with Python because really data science came out of that sort of space, and that's the language they use. But most of the leading libraries also then support TypeScript as their second language. And I think that shows a recognition of the AI ecosystem that JavaScript and TypeScript is going to be an important player in terms of consuming those services. In terms of my pick, I've been looking at this week, it's the B-Agent framework. It's actually one which started life as TypeScript instead of Python, which is nice to see as a Node developer that somebody started with a JavaScript implementation. It lets you write agents that call functions more easily. So I've been playing around with that. And if you're interested in Node and consuming AI from JavaScript and TypeScript, I'd throw that over as my pick to go take a look at that.
Very cool. Now, before we wrap up, if people want to get in touch with you guys to talk about what we talked about today, I don't know if you still do consulting work or in general just to speak with you, how do they get in touch? Michael, what's the best way to contact you?
I think, Twitter, my handle's there, MHDawson1. You can just reach out to me through that.
Excellent. And how about you, James?
Same Twitter. I'm JA Snell on Twitter and on GitHub. I think we have to be following each other for you to DM me, but feel free to reach out, do a public shout out on me on there. Happy to chat.
Excellent. So, guys, it was great having you on, and I really hope we can organize and schedule the follow-up, because we do really need to cover the rest of the pillars. The ones that we did were so great. Thank you for coming on, and to all our listeners, thank you for listening in, and goodbye.